Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest Peter member webinar, Exploring Middle Grade and Young Adult Fiction. My name is Cassie. I am the Marketing Communications Manager at Peter, and I am so pleased to be here with all of you for the next 45 minutes. Before I do anything else, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work. That's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I just want to pay my respects to elders past and present. Talking about stories on the lands of the oldest living culture on Earth, one with a long history of storytelling, is an immense privilege. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Really quick housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded, and so we do ask that you keep your microphones on mute so that we can all hear our amazing guest speaker loud and clear. However, of course, we still want to hear from you. If you have any comments or questions, please do just drop them into the chat box and we will make sure that you're heard. You don't have to wait until the end, so drop them in whenever you like. This is your webinar and we really love it when you join in. I think there's going to be some book recommendations coming up, and you might have some that you want to share that everyone can benefit from. So let's see what happens. Now, onto the good stuff. I am so pleased to introduce you all to Danielle Binks. Danielle is a Melbourne-based writer and literary agent. In 2017, she edited and contributed to Begin and Begin, an anthology of new Australian young adult writing inspired by the hashtag LoveAusYA movement, which won the ABIA Book of the Year Award for older children. The year the maps changed, which I am now going to hold up and hope you can see me, is Danielle's debut middle grade novel, and it was a 2021 Children's Book Council of Australia notable book. Her first solo young adult novel is The Monster of Her Age, which I read in one greedy sitting on Sunday and thoroughly enjoyed, which Danielle is holding up. And she also teaches the writing stream for the Associate Degree of Professional Writing and Editing at RMIT University. She is a little bit busy. Welcome, Danielle.
Hi, everybody. I am zooming in to you all on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. So hello, and thank you for having me and for that lovely introduction. Hi.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. And please tell us, how did you start writing for children and young people, and what drew you towards those stories in particular?
Oh, gosh. You know what really set it off? Apart from being a reader of young adult literature my whole life, I mean, I think I've grown up in the generation who had young adult literature marketed to us very specifically, and I've just never let it go. Also, probably because lots of the authors that I read as a teenager continue to write and add to the readership even now. So Melina Marchetta springs to mind. Of course she does. She's my queen. Anyone who knows me knows that I bow at the feet of Melina Marchetta. But I think the impulse to write for children and middle grade specifically probably kicked off with when I read Rebecca Stead's When You Reach Me. This is an American book that came out in 2009, and it won the Newbery Medal in 2009. Maybe it came out in 2008. This was the book that I read that everyone seemed to be talking about at the time. And I remember the term middle grade being thrown around. And it was the first time that I also found out what the Newbery Medal was, which is a children's book award from the American Library Association. I loved this so much, and I just instantly tapped into the feelings of the young person in it who is, from memory, like 11 going on 12, that primary school age. I thought it was a fabulous mystery. I just really felt the emotions of this. And in particular there's like a mystery in there. It's a bit of a time slip, or is it? It's a bit of a conundrum. But also in there is this central story of a young girl who's maybe having very different social interactions to her longtime friend. They're just at very different points in their young life where he's going through some stuff that she can't quite relate to. And I just thought that was such a beautiful moment on the cusp of everything. And yeah, just as a person tapping back into that emotion of being in primary school, it was so easy for me to do that as a reader that I wanted to start exploring it more as a writer. And partly to do that, I did go off and I did research the Newbery Medal. And I also read another great book that I loved, Sharon Creech's Walk Two Moons, which I think won the Newbery in like 1994. But reading through the whole list of winners and everything of the Newbery, I just thought it really appealed to me. And so many of the books really appealed to me. And this one in particular that I plucked out from the list, having read the blurb and thought it sounded amazing, just really spoke to me and set the benchmark for what middle grade can do and can be. But at the same time, I realized that I'd always been reading middle grade because I also saw that The Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Paterson had won the Newbery back in 1978, right? It's an old book. but it looms large. And I realized that, oh, I'd been always reading in this readership. I just hadn't been conscious of it. Barry Johnsberg's My Life as an Alphabet, I realized retrospectively as well, is probably more middle grade than young adult, even though at the time, the Australian scene, publishing scene, wasn't categorizing it that way. Once I tapped into the American Newbery Medal and what was happening in middle grade over there and reading a lot of it, I started to see what was missing in the Australian landscape, but also what we'd always had. So it was very much me coming to it as both reader first and foremost, and then realizing that I wanted to tap into that as a writer as well. So it was a little bit copacetic, but definitely it was Rebecca Stead kicking things off for me in the middle grade realm.
I love that you had your whole stack there ready with recommendations. That is so exciting. Although you did remind me of Bridge to Terabithia, which made me cry a lot as a child. And so now I'm just going to have to process that again. But that's fine.
I'm so sorry, but not sorry. It's a great book. And it's a decent movie adaptation as well. Fairly decent. I don't hate it. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes that's all you can ask for. When you were younger, what did you look for in a book to read? So when you were in the middle grade sort of age bracket yourself, what were you looking for? What did you want in a book? And has that changed?
I was an emotional child and I was drawn to big emotional stories. Absolutely. So what comes to mind is, and oh my gosh, I have the original cover of this. Wait till you see this. Robin Klein's Came Back to Show You I Could Fly. The original like Meg Ryan cover is iconic in Australian children's books. Are you kidding me? Look at that cover. Very clearly Meg Ryan inspired. This is a great big emotional book and I loved it. I loved reading it in primary school and thinking that I was so mature and barely understanding what was happening, I think. But just loving the connection of with Angie and just loving the emotions of it and loving this boy who felt abandoned. I really gravitated towards kids who had big feelings and could articulate them or were angry or sad. I really loved that. It tapped into the way that I felt as a kid that was very put upon, that was very not heard by my family, that felt a bit picked on by my older cousins when I was playing with them and stuff. So I really wanted to tap into that emotion. And then I also, it has to be said, Playing BT Bow by Ruth Park, that I had to read. It was set for me as set reading. You had to choose an Australian story to read. And I chose this. And it was the first time I can remember actually very much being conscious of Australia as a setting, because the Sydney Harbour Bridge plays a really big role in this, initially in the first instance of Time Slip. But I just remember reading this and feeling proud that it was an Australian book. And that was just a really weird feeling to have as a young person and think, oh, can I think of anything else that I've read that's Australian? So I absolutely loved this. Also, the very gentle, small amount of romance in this was of interest to me. And obviously I followed through with that. I do love a romance book. Monster of Her Age has romance in it because that's my jam. And then I think it was stuff like Looking for Alibrandi, Melina Marchetta, came out when I was in primary school and was the most talked about book. And that sticker on it loomed large and meant a lot. I remember it being the most shoplifted book from libraries and bookstores, and that had a cool factor to it as well. I also remember Jacqueline Moriarty, Finding Cass Crazy, in this whole series. Also just really, really spoke to me and I absolutely adored it. So all these books that just have big emotions, they're just big, messy emotions, and it's young people getting to live in their emotions a little bit. And that's totally what I still write, what I still read, what I still gravitate towards. Contemporary fiction is my baby. It's what I love most of all. I do totally love reading crime and thriller and fantasy and sci-fi and all of that, but contemporary is my lodestone, because I do like big emotions and messy families and a grounding in the here and now and talking about what we're all going through in a way that we can all touch base and understand. So yeah, that's what I loved as a kid, and that's what I still love as an adult, as a reader, and also as a writer. 100%.
That idea of being able to sort of touch someone else's feelings and relate them back to your own is, I think, really powerful in this sort of age group and space. And definitely, if anyone has any particular favorite middle grade books, now is a great time to jump into the chat and tell us, because it sounds like we've got a bit of a fan here. Yes. And we can have some exciting conversations. So do let us know if you've got any favorites. While you're doing that though, Danielle, can you tell us a bit about your middle grade book, how the maps changed and what was going through your mind as you wrote it, and what you wanted to explore in it, what you wanted to avoid, what you wanted to highlight, given that you were writing for this very particular age group?
Yeah. So It's set in 1999 for the very specific reason that that's when the Kosovo War was happening, and that is a big touchstone plot point in this novel. It's based on the fact that in 1999, at the height of the Kosovo War, Australia, the UK, US, and New Zealand did enter into what Australia called Operation Safe Haven, which was bringing across about 4,000 Kosovar Albanian refugees and giving them safe haven at 8 different safe haven locations around the country, one of which was near where I grew up, the Point Nepean National Park. The quarantine station there was one of the places where they housed them. And my character in the book is 11 going on 12 because that's the age I was in 1999. And I vaguely remembered these events happening, partly because my father, much like Fred's father in the book, Luca, is a police officer, so was mine, and had a little bit to do with the Red Cross at that time as well. So I very much had these kind of vague memories of what was happening. And then what triggered it all was in 2016, in the lead up to the state election, the Victorian Opposition Party were talking about reopening the quarantine station and using it as a detention centre now, in the here and now. And it got a lot of pushback from locals. I mean, a lot of pushback from locals who said, we do not want that. And it wasn't for the reasons that you think. It was because many of them had been around in 1999 to see Operation Safe Haven. And they said, we have good memories of that time. We don't want them to be distorted by what refugees and asylum seekers have now become in the media because of politics. Back when it was Operation Safe Haven, at the height of the Kosovo War, when they came over here for refuge, they were allowed to come and go from the quarantine station in the beginning. They weren't locked in there. They integrated with the towns around them. And the modern idea of an Australian detention centre is not that. So the public were really precious about wanting to keep their memories of that time intact. And I wanted to tap into that because I thought, wow, how incredible. The second I did even a little bit of research into this, I thought, how incredible that in 1999, there was public pressure on the Howard government to bring refugees here. And Philip Ruddock at the time in Howard said, look, it's not feasible for us to fly plane loads of refugees into the country. And then after Easter, they did exactly that because of public pressure, because the public were seeing these images beamed into their television screens, hearing about it on the radio, and they wanted help. They wanted to help. And then how incredible that happened in 1999. And then in 2001, it all turns around. There's September 11, and there's also the Tampa affair, which I know we've just approached a tragic anniversary of that as well. But those two events laying side by side and coming after 1999 Operation Safe Haven, I thought, wow, we've really distorted how we treat refugees and asylum seekers in this country. Let's talk about that tangentially by discussing the history and the true history of Operation Safe Haven. It is a fictionalized account because it is largely also about my character, Fred, and the upheaval she's going through in her life at the time, which is her mother died when she was 6. She's 11 going on 12 when the book begins, and her adoptive father, Luca, has a new partner who is pregnant. And she's coming into the home with her own child from another marriage. And that's a whole lot of upheaval. And the way that Fred categorizes it is it's like the maps are being redrawn and I'm being left off the page. So that's why that's a theme in there of maps and geography, which she also loves because her teacher, Mr. Curry, encourages her curiosity about the world. And look, I've read and listened to criticism of the book that says, well, it's from the perspective of a young white girl in Australia who's seeing refugees come, and she befriends a pregnant refugee who becomes very intrinsic to the story as well. It's not very reflective of, refugee crisis and everything. And I completely absorb that and accept it. That's fine. But I wasn't trying to tell that story. There are first-person account stories in nonfiction, like Behrouz Boochani's, that tell of the real plight of refugees. There are some beautiful fictionalized accounts of perspective of refugees trying to cross borders and trying to flee. Those books exist. I don't think I could write that book myself from where I sat, but I did think I could tell the story of what it felt like at the time to see the world, kind of going up in flames, and as a kid wanting to help, and as a kid wondering why adults didn't do more. So that's the perspective that I chose. I chose the lens of Fred, who's 11 going on 12, who is dealing with the way that her town, Sorrento on the Mornington Peninsula, deals with these refugees coming into their orbit, the good and the bad responses from the town. And that's what I wanted to do, because I thought that would allow me to talk a little bit about maybe talk a little bit about the empathy that's been lacking in Australian society with regards to refugees and asylum seekers. So that was what I was trying to do first and foremost in the year the maps changed, was remind people of our history in this, and to also just say, look, it wasn't that long ago that we were doing the right thing. What changed? How did this all go wrong? And that's what I was trying to do in this book, is just, ask those questions of kids.
How did you approach, these are, really, really big topics, obviously, and obviously really big topics exist even when you are a young reader and you have feelings about them, but how did you approach writing to the age group when we're talking about stuff that is really big and really heavy? What did you keep in mind?
You know what? Another middle grade book that I would categorize as such now, but that I really, really loved. And I mean, I've loved all his books growing up. And I particularly love his book Once. You all know who I'm going to talk about now. But I read Morris Gleitzman's Grace, which is such a beautiful book. And I don't think it gets talked about enough. This is such a beautiful book about a young person whose family are from a pretty extreme religious background. And there's a fracture, there's a fallout within her family unit. And she gets kind of excommunicated along with her family, and how that feels. This was a book of such big emotions. And I interviewed Morris Gleitzman at the time, around about the time that Once came out as well, which was getting kind of feedback of, oh, did you go too extreme in this story that's about the Holocaust and it's very graphic in some parts and not in others, etc. And I asked Morris Gleitzman, as a fan of his and as somebody who was an aspiring writer at the time, I kind of said to him, how do you know where to draw the line when writing for very young kids? And he said, and I've always lived by this, he said, if it's in the world, it's for them. So realistically, there's no topic that is off limits. If it's in the world, it's for them. Then the matter becomes, as a writer, what lens do I use to tell this story? What language do I use? What barriers do I put up in that regard? That aren't really barriers. They're just signifiers and markers of who your young audience is, what they can handle, what they can comprehend and understand, what's too much for them. But ultimately, if it's in the world, it's for them. And I think that I'm going to live by that forevermore as a writer, because I think Morris Gleitzman has shown that most definitely on any breadth of topic. And remember, he was writing about refugees and asylum seekers with Girl Underground, Boy Overboard, a long ways back. I think he's done a very good job of it. And if I can pick up that ball and run with it as well, if it's in the world, it's for them, then I'll continue to do that as a writer.
That's such a beautiful way of phrasing it. I love that. If it's in the world, it's for them.
Yeah.
Amazing.
He's pretty good, right? Oh, Morris.
Yeah, he's okay. That's wonderful. Now I have to ask about transitioning from middle grade to young adult. Your new book is The Monster of Her Age, which is a young adult novel. It is so much fun. It imagines that we had a thriving film industry to rival Hollywood. It's a story about a young girl and things she's going through in her family and her life. It is so alive. How did you make the mental shift? Did you feel a mental shift when you went from middle grade to young adult? What was the process like? Was it different?
Yes. And I came up for the idea of The Monster of Her Age while I was writing The Year the Maps Changed, which is not too surprising because The Year the Maps Changed took me 5 years to write. From first concept to execution of the first draft, 5 years. So it wasn't too surprising that I had another idea in the middle of all that. But I think it was writing middle grade. And of course, what I couldn't put into middle grade, or what I didn't want to put into this middle grade, was stuff like romance. That wasn't really appropriate to my story. There was other bigger things going on. Didn't need that. There's like the smallest smidge of a possible hint of it towards the very end, but it's there and gone. Or if you don't look for it, it's not there at all. And it's just like the very first fluttery feelings of first romance, like a holding hands type thing. So I think when I was writing that, I was pulling and thinking, oh, I'd really like to write a very lovely romance, the type of romance that I wanted to read when I was a teenager. So I was being pulled in that direction. And then now, when I was writing The Monster of Her Age, I've had an idea for another middle grade book that I'm working on. So I think I'll always exist in a place of the grass is always greener, or being pulled to the opposite direction of what I'm currently writing, which I think is also just my brain is able to be freed up in that space. Once I'm no longer immersed in the readership, I have a little bit more room to imagine. But the first thing that I do whenever I set out with a story, to determine if it's YA or middle grade, because the year the maps changed was nearly going to be YA. It was nearly going to be a 17-year-old male protagonist telling that story. And it wasn't until I decided to gift the story more of my own background as an 11 going on 12-year-old in 1999 that it really opened up for me. But I found that now as a writer, one of the first questions I ask myself when thinking up a new story is, how much does the young person in the central role rely on their family? Or how much can they break away from them? And that's a big theme of The Monster of Her Age, is my character Ellie having to recognize that her family's hurt her in the past, and she can still love them and be angry at them, and she can exist in all these spaces, because love is complex, families are complex. But I think in middle grade, kids still need family, whether that's adopted family, etc. They still need the family base. Whereas in YA, I think we see kids who are more willing to start venturing away, going out on their own, building their own found families. And that for me is always the difference. I gravitate towards writing families and family dramas. So that's the way that for myself, I figure it out. Is this a young person who still needs their family and needs to grow with their family? Or is this a young person who's nearly ready to break away from them and think for themselves and go out on their own a little bit and look for their own found family now? So that's how I kind of shift gears in my mind. It all comes back to family for me.
Did The Monster of Her Age also take about 5 years?
No, this one was contracted. When I sold the year the maps changed to my publisher, I also had the very vague idea of The Monster of Her Age that was pitched using the Linda Blair quote that appears in the front of the book. The quote being from Linda Blair, who said, "The Exorcist has been a very interesting cross to bear." I kind of said that I was going to go off and explore that with a fictional Australian film history. And my publisher bought that concept from me and then gave me 12 months to write it, which meant I was writing The Monster of Her Age during lockdown. I was able to squeeze in a research trip to Hobart, which is where the novel takes place entirely. I went there in December 2019. And then I had to start writing it throughout 2020 and editing it throughout 2020 in lockdowns. And then it released in August through another lockdown. So it is my little time capsule of this very strange time, but I do love it regardless.
It's so new. Have you received any feedback from readers of that book yet, or is it still too new? If you have, I would love to hear how they've found it, what's resonated with them.
I've recently joined TikTok, and I don't want to be a lurker, but I'm seeing people posting about it, and I'm trying to post my own book talk videos, but I'm not very good at it. I might just give it up eventually. I maybe it's just not the space for me. I don't know, but I am seeing a little bit of feedback of it, and I'm hearing that they love that it's an LGBT romance in there, which I'm very appreciative that they gravitate towards that. They love the fictional Australian film history and the way that I've been able to talk about art. That's also because I was writing this during lockdowns. Clearly, I was talking to a need to fund the arts and the here and now, that I was managing to slip that in there in this book as well. And I'm very moved by young readers who appreciate that I'm articulating the feeling of being gaslit by family members who try and play down your hurt, your emotional pain, or the ways that they've hurt you in the past, not necessarily physical, but different types of abuse. They appreciate the complexities of that, and that I'm saying it's okay to still be angry at someone and grieving over them and loving them, and also not being willing to forgive them. So they're appreciating those nuances in it, and I'm very happy for that. But most of all, I think they've been loving the LGBT plus queer romance that's in there, which makes my heart sing completely.
And it's so perfect for book talk as well. I feel like that's such a popular corner of it, which I love. What I found really interesting about the book is both the advocacy for the arts within it, and certainly there's a note about how our film industry was defunded, and that's why it did not develop like other film industries did across the world. Why we were really sort of hamstrung and only put out a couple of films a year for decades. So you're introducing that kind of history alongside your alternative one. And you also spend a lot of time in the book talking about feminist readings of horror films. So you're creating these conversations and new ways of seeing art around the young reader, which I find really fascinating. Is that something that you remember happening in books you read, or was it something that you just really wanted to pass on?
It's more my film nerd coming out. I do love horror films. I do absolutely love horror films. And it's okay if people watching don't like horror. This is kind of a modern emotional feminist horror. It's not a jump scare horror. It's a very different kind of scary story. But no, I've always loved horror films. And it's always been disappointing to me when people only categorize them as like slasher films. That's very much what they were in the 80s, but horror's come a long way and it's having very big conversations with various members of different communities, like Get Out, which is about it's about racism, but shielded in such a way that you can talk about it very directly without making anyone feel like they're being bombarded by rhetoric about racism. It comes at it in a very interesting way that I think opens the conversation up a lot more. And there's been a lot of feminist horror. There's a lot of women out there creating horror, writing horror. And I think it's time that we all acknowledge that Mary Shelley was a badass. I again reference and quote her throughout as well, because Frankenstein's one of my favorite books, a book that I read in year 12 and hated at the time and had to come back to it as an adult without the pressures of exams and essay to be written about it, and realize that, oh my gosh, Mary Shelley invented science fiction as an 18-year-old, the first non-religious creationist myth. She basically has added to the modern horror genre in so many myriad ways and was just a complete legend. I bring all that to the table because it's just my nerd self coming through. I wanted it to come out. I let it have free reign in this book.
I love that it's also such an example for young readers who might want to be writers, that they can write about the things that excite them, that interest them, and that speak to them, because you include it so seamlessly into the book that it sort of starts to reveal a story as something that can be shaped by interests, which is really exciting.
Yeah, and by horror and romance, probably the two genres that are most impacted by social change. So you see things in horror films that are reflecting the times, like for instance, Carrie and Stephen King, the Carrie novel and film adaptation, when it came out, that came out at the height of the AIDS epidemic. So suddenly blood takes on new symbolism in that sense. It's also things like Rosemary's Baby was coming out at the height of like a new wave of feminism. So the control that women had over their bodies in a movie that's about demon possession takes on totally new myriad ways. And I mean, we all know that, right? We all know that reading Metamorphosis, Kafka changes once you know his background as a queer writer, as a queer individual, etc. Tapping into that with genre is really fascinating to me, to say, hey, look for what's between the lines, look at the story behind the story, which is also kind of what Ali's doing in this book as well. Ali's someone who's saying, hey, I was in this made up horror film that you all had this idea of who I was as a child monster, as the kind of Regan character in like an Exorcist-esque film. But let's talk about what happened behind the scenes of that. The story behind the story is just as important. I think that's what we're doing in genre. In genre, most of the time, we're kind of distorting a message and making it a bit funhouse mirror so that we can look at it a little bit more front on. And I love that. I don't do it myself. I'm not really a genre writer myself, but in this, I was allowed to go a little bit meta and talk about genre and like the behind the scenes of genre, which I really enjoyed.
It's so fun to read as well, because you can feel the passion of it, which makes it amazing. Also, all these fictional Australian films that you've created are just delightful.
Thank you.
I do want to ask, you wrote this brilliant essay in Kill Your Darlings, a literary magazine, in 2014, about the importance of LGBTQ plus representation in children's literature. And you've written now a book with a lovely queer relationship at the center. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about LGBTQ books for children and young people, particularly if you have recommendations that teachers could be using in the classroom, and your thoughts on the space in general.
Oh gosh, I think it's very important to keep adding to it. I love that since I wrote that article, it's just grown and grown and grown and grown. And there are so many recommendations I could give now, and I'm going to give them. You better believe I've got books beside me. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to recommend Meet Me at the Intersection, which is not directly queer narratives. It's different stories told by various writers of various marginalized backgrounds all coming together, including queer stories. I think it's a really good idea to open up this conversation by offering kids short stories to read and letting them just dip into this world that way a little bit, dip in and out and see what they gravitate towards, because lots of kids will still be queer and questioning and figuring things out. They may not want to read that directly. It may be a little bit too intense for them. So giving them like an anthology collection where it comes at it in a few different ways could be a really good idea. Which was also my chance to say in Beginner Love Osway A anthology, there's a few queer stories in here as well, which could be a good way to come at it. There is the wonderful Kindred, which is an actual collection of 12 queer stories by Love Osway Australian YA authors. This is a really good idea as well, because it dips in and out of different genres. I think showing kids that queer stories are not just contemporary, which is what they've long been, but showing them that queer identities exist across different realms, different genres, different spaces is really, really important. Because no kid who's trying to look inward and think, does this fit me? Does this speak to me? Nobody wants to just read or just think that they're in one box, one very narrow box. They want to see themselves in all genres. They want to see themselves in outer space. They want to see themselves in the Scottish Highlands. They want those options to see that you can be absolutely anything as a queer person. Very important anthology collection. I'd also say I think graphic novels and comic books are really important. And C.S. Pacat has this beautiful series of comics called Fence that are now in collected volume form that are just beautiful. And I think you can probably tell just from looking, this series includes trans characters, non-binary characters, queer and questioning characters. I think you can probably tell just from looking at the covers. It's very impactful seeing this in illustrated form as well, to actually see themselves represented as characters on the page and multicultural characters as well. Really, really important, where they can actually, it's a little bit more of a mirror, which is really important, right? There's a quote that I gave, I think in that LGBT plus Kill Your Darlings article, which is, we read to know that we're not alone. And this is a really great example of how you can gently encourage and show kids that. Some more shout outs. One of my authors who was recently shortlisted in the CBCA, Peter Lyer's Rating Normal. Anna Waitley, who wrote this, is neurodiverse. She's on the autism spectrum. She has ADHD, and her character, Peter Lyer, does as well. Again, I think very important to show queer identities are not just one thing. They're not just queer, they're also neurodiverse. So there's different ways to talk about queer identities. That's not just one box, I think is very, very important. And again, speaking to the Australian landscape, Will Kostakis has this really great series out that is taking big mythological fantasy ideas and also throwing in queer characters who, that's not necessarily the crux of the story. Obviously, when there are gods coming to life, the story is not about, hey, my boyfriend dumped me, but it's there tangentially, it's there incidentally, that I think is really important as well. Again, integrating these identities into different fantasy spaces, very, very important. Will Kostakis, who's also just a fabulous public speaker and wonderful advocate for youth literature as well. And then on the international space, I would also again say graphic novels. Raina Teiglemeier, Drama is one of my favorite graphic novels of hers. And this one's probably more in the middle grade space. This would be appropriate for middle grade audience. Again, this is a story where the main storyline is not about a queer identity or somebody coming out, which those stories are still very important, but they're not the be all and end all. This is the story about the central character who is not identifying as LGBT, but it's her coming to terms with one of her friends who is, and who has a big kind of dramatic, flamboyant, beautiful moment in the school play where he has to be the stand-in for the young female lead who storms off the stage, and he has to be the stand-in, and he gets this beautiful moment of putting the dress on and also, and this is important, why it's important to give them graphic novels as well, to show them this, he will also, hold on, it's coming, wait for the big moment, he gets his beautiful on-stage kiss. And you can imagine being a middle grade primary school kid and getting to see that and loving it, loving the visual representation of that is really empowering as well. And also, like I said, that this is not the main story. It's just a secondary story in there as well, which is really important to show that you can just be the incidental stories in these as well. Really, really important. So Raina Teiglemeier, Drama, beautiful book. I also really loved recently Becky Albertelli, who was the queen of this, right? Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda. This is another one, Kate in Waiting, where it's a young woman coming to terms with, she's had a queer best friend for a long time and they've always gotten along like houses on fire, but when they both have a crush on the same boy, things get a little bit complex. And I think it's good to show complex relationships and that it's an ongoing conversation of somebody in your life. You know, it's an ongoing conversation when they start having feelings for somebody else and they can start living in their truth a little bit more. You have to respect that, and you have to adapt your life a little bit to it as well, and help them. I think that's a really beautiful representation of that. The Falling in Love montage by Kiara Smith. I think she's an Irish author. I think Irish. I loved this. I will say there's not a lot out there that is queer female YA stories. There's statistics around this. It goes back to the fan fiction writings of the Harry and Draco, what's called fan fiction, that they did studies finding that many young female writers and readers of fan fiction would gravitate towards male queer stories, because that was an easier way for them to explore their own sexuality and identity without looking at it too head on. So maybe it's too much for them to read, you know, they were speculating that maybe it's too much for them to read female pairing queer stories because they're not ready to admit that in themselves. So it sort of alleviates the pressure to read queer stories featuring male protagonists. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be giving them queer stories featuring women as well. So that's a really great, as is mine, but that's another great book that I absolutely love. And then on the middle grade space, these stories do exist in middle grade. I know there's not a lot of them on the Australian landscape right now. They tend to be secondary storylines, which I'm loving that so much. And an example of that as well, this book, have you all read this? Two Night Owl from Dogfish. It's an epistolatory novel that is these two girls whose fathers are dating and they kind of hate each other, but they have to go away on school camp together and learn to get along. This one was beautiful, you know, having queer parents, absolutely fantastic, beautiful story. And there's also this one by Benjamin Dean, Me, My Dad, and the End of the Rainbow. This is a young man whose father has come out as gay. He's leaving his mother, divorcing his mother. His father is coming out as gay and he's having to deal with that and accept his father. And it's a really beautiful story. That's another middle grade book. So I just think offering for a range of ages and also a range of genres, and stories where the queer romance is central to the story or it's secondary to the plot, just to show that variety is really important. But really it just comes down to, we read to know that we're not alone. That's what you're trying to gift kids, is saying to them, maybe they're questioning and they're just exploring, and this is not the definitive of who they're going to be, but they just want to see these representations on the page to start figuring it out in themselves. So you just want to gift them that because it's very important. I wish I had more of that growing up. I didn't. I'm okay now. I've rebounded in the terms of I've written my own love story, the one that I wanted to read when I was a teenager. But gosh, how much I would have loved to have been handed one of those books at like a crucial time where it was also important, I think, if librarians had spaces put aside on shelves, maybe they're a bit more tucked away so that there's not going to be on display if a kid is looking through the shelves looking for something that's LGBT plus. But even just a librarian or a teacher handing me one of those books and kind of raving about how amazing it is, how beautiful it is, would have just alleviated a lot of pressure for me. So if you can do that for a young person, you're a hero. Totally. I know that was a lot of Rex. That was a lot
so
of Rex.
many. Thank you. I think we are all very grateful to you for giving such a great overview of what is available, how it can be talked about, how it can be introduced. What a fantastic resource. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's absolutely wonderful. If you do have any questions or comments, or if you have recommendations to make, now is a good time to drop them in the chat because we've just got a few minutes left. But while you're doing that, I do have two very important questions for Danielle. So I'm just going to keep going. If you could give one piece of writing advice for our teacher audience to pass on to their students, say, I was talking to this author and she said this one thing, what would you say?
Read a lot. If you want to, I go by the Stephen King advice. If you want to be a writer, you've got to do two things: read a lot and write a lot. And before I begin any project, I gorge myself on books. If I know I'm going to be writing in the middle grade space, I go out and I read so much middle grade, not necessarily in the same genre, but just to get into the beats and the rhythms and to see where the goal is at, where the goalposts are. I want to know what's out there. Read a lot. I also highly recommend reading poetry. So any kids out there who say they want to be writers one day, even just reading a page of poetry a night, there's been proof that when we read poetry, it fires the synapses in our brain the same way that listening to music does. Reading poetry, incredibly important. You will start making better prose once you read the prose of poetry. It will fire you up. So read a lot, read everything, read every single genre you can get your hands on, but also do read poetry. It's a good one.
That is a fantastic piece of advice, I think. Thank you. My second question is, if you could give one piece of reading advice to teachers who are teaching in the primary and in the lower secondary space, what would your advice be? Doesn't necessarily have to be a book recommendation, but or maybe a way of reading, or maybe both. Up to you.
I think it is perfectly okay to read, as you know, I recommended a bunch of them. Read graphic novels, read comic books, listen to audiobooks. All of that is absolutely perfect. Graphic novels especially work on such a high literacy level where you have to match up the images to the text, and when there's conflicting, it's almost like an unreliable narrator, right, where the image belies what's happening in the text, etc. It functions on such a high verbal and image literacy level. It's a lot of cogs turning when kids read graphic novels and comic books. It's a lot of cogs turning. And any kids that are struggling to get their reading done, their recreational reading done, because it's just hard right now in lockdowns, or life is just getting on top of them a little bit, graphic novels are a really great way to say to them, it's not less reading, it's not less than, it's still complicated, complex reading, but something about it, I think, unlocks kids' imaginations and brains, and they just love it. So lean into graphic novels and comic books as much as you can, and audiobooks, 100%.
Thank you so much. We have a lovely comment from Robin, who so enjoyed the year the maths changed, which didn't we all? And thank you for the recommendations, which again, I think we are all so grateful for the massive amount of recommendations that you have given us that are effectively kind of a history of middle grade writing too, sort of pointing away towards what's happening now. So thank you.
And you know what? If you want a poetry recommendation, I'm just going to type somebody's name here. This is a young slam poet champion in Australia, Solil Raphael. His books are Spotlight and Limelight. I think he was published as a 16-year-old. He's pretty impressive as a poet. His books are out with Penguin Random House now. But if you could even show his poetry slam championships to kids in YouTube, because he's all over YouTube, that is just incredible for them to see what poetry can do and can be, and to get the idea that poetry is essentially music. You know, it's lyricism, it's beauty, etc. I think that's really impressive. I'm also just a fan of Emily Dickinson. I think still one of the greatest. I also love Gwen Harwood. Again, in school I had to read Gwen Harwood, and I just loved her poetry instantly, that it was such a moment of Australiana to a lot of them. Absolutely loved it. So yeah, tell your students that I say read poetry. Read a page of poetry a night. I guarantee they'll want to read more than a page. Poetry is beautifully addictive. And I was very happy. One of my favorite poems and poets is referenced in The Monster of Her Age, Anna Akhmatova. One of my favorite lines of her poetry is in this, and I had to actually appeal to the Russian embassy, who now has control of her estate. And they let me use the line of poetry. My publisher had to pay them, I think, like 500 Australian dollars to let us use it. But yeah, Anna Akhmatova is in this book, which I'm so happy about because she's my favorite poet of all time. And it's one of my favorite poems in the book. I'm not going to tell you which one. I was going to quote it, but I thought, no, if you want to discover, you'll have to go and read. Yeah, Anna Akhmatova, just one of my favorite poets. And I got to pay tribute to her the same way that I got to fangirl over Mary Shelley in this book as well. I'm just, tipping my hat to the legends that came before. And I was very happy to do that. I think I also squeezed in there a reference, because a lot of this takes place at the State Cinema in Hobart. I got to reference the Looking for Alibrandi movie. That's a movie poster that's hanging up. So I got to reference at least 3 queens in this book, Anna Akhmatova, Melina Marchetta, and Mary Shelley. I got to do that. So I was very pleased with that. That was my bingo.
It's so lovely. Now everyone just wants to go and read the book to find out the quote.
Yeah, find it. You know what? You're going to read it and you're going to want to go off and find some more Anna Akhmatova poetry. And I fully recommend that you do. And yes, I had to email the Russian embassy and say, hi, can you, I've got a weird query for you. I'm writing a young adult novel and I'm a big fan. So yeah, worth it, totally worth it. And they were actually very, very lovely.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that too. What a great little
Factoid.
insight, yes, into publishing. We have this lovely comment here from Shamila. Thank you for showing how and why authors are motivated to write, which is, I know exactly, I feel exactly the same way. You've given us such a beautiful insight into the craft of writing, the love of writing, what it's like to read. We have a late breaking question, so I'm going to start talking and ask Carmel's question, which is, are you a fan of verse novels?
Yes. Sister Heart, Sally Morgan. Are you kidding me? One of the most beautiful verse novels. And I actually have, as a literary agent, which is my day job, I've signed up 2 verse novelists in recent months who are writing YA verse novels, or a middle grade verse novel and a YA verse novel. I'm also a big Pip Harry fan. Who doesn't love Pip Harry? Come on. I love verse novels. I absolutely adore them. And I love, again, recommending those to young people who maybe think, maybe there's someone who just loves music, and maybe for them, poetry and verse novels are the way into reading and writing for them. And once you tell them that, hey, your music, your lyrics could be a novel in itself, just opening the world up for them is incredible. I myself cannot write poetry, but I'm a great admirer of it, which I think is just a pure joy. I love poetry because I only ever come to it as an admirer and a reader, and to have that escapism in poetry and verse novels is just, it's a gift. I love it.
I also have fantastic news for everyone who is on this webinar. Our next webinar next week is on verse novels with Pip Harry.
Oh, I didn't even know that. And I just dropped that perfectly
up.
And seamlessly. Say hi to Pip for me. I adore Pip Harry. I'm a huge fan of her books. Yay.
Oh, I absolutely will.
Fangirl.
We're building this lovely continuum in these webinars, so I think you have to come back for part 2, everybody. Yeah. Thank you so much for all your time. We've taken up a little bit more extra than we said we would, but only just a couple of minutes. Thank you so much. You've given us some great recommendations, some beautiful enthusiasm. I am going to go read poetry in a minute. So thank you so much. Have a lovely evening. Thank you, everyone, for giving your time to us. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. I so appreciate any enthusiasm you have for me and my books is so greatly appreciated. They both came out during lockdown, so I am very reliant on librarians and teachers spreading the word about these books. I'm so grateful to you. And I think you're all superheroes for what you've been accomplishing through some continuing unprecedented times. We were told they were unprecedented for 1 year, but they're continuing to be unprecedented. And that is tough. And I just think all the teachers in my family, I continually tell them that I just bow down. I did CBCA book week over Zoom. Oof, that just about laid me flat on the floor. So that you all do this regularly is just mind-boggling to me. And I'm so appreciative. And I just admire all of you very, very much. Thank you for coming today. Enjoy Pip Harry next week. Tell her I'm a fan. Tell her I adore her books, please.
We are going to write that into the questions. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Happy reading. Bye.